Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Ollie Gagnon, the Chief Homeland Security Advisor at Idaho National Laboratory, and Matt Rogers, the Operational Technology Cyber Lead at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Ollie, Matt, it's great to have you both here. This is a really exciting time to be having this conversation about OT security. Obviously, there's so much discussion in the cybersecurity community about threats to critical infrastructure, the typhoon, Bolt typhoon, Salt typhoon, so on and so forth. And I think a lot of that discussion implicates, of course, operational technology to a degree and this convergence between IT and OT. And so I'm really excited to have you both here to dig into that. Ollie, if we can start with you and your perch at Idaho National Laboratory, obviously supporting government and critical infrastructure on these issues. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you all do to advance OT security?
Yeah, appreciate that, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Matt. In terms of Idaho National Laboratory, just kind of level set. The national laboratories, Department of Energy National Laboratories, have been working with DHS and other Homeland Security partners for over 20 years. National labs exist to innovate against challenges, and besides being the nation's nuclear laboratory, Idaho National Laboratory, we are also known for our industrial control system, security, and resilience, obviously operational technology. And we've been in that field for a very, very long time, obviously starting with nuclear. So in terms, I'm glad Matt's here today because we do a lot with Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And we have many, many different areas that we support them. And, CISA has a services delivery model that they bring out to the critical infrastructure community. We support that very directly. We also support the DoD and Department of Energy. Obviously, we're an energy laboratory. So in terms of our support, we play that major role in industrial control system security and operational technology system, that underpin what we call critical infrastructure. And obviously, that's the big systems, the power, the water, the telecommunications, those sectors overall. So our work combines a combination of engineering, cybersecurity, threat intelligence, risk analysis, and really hands-on experimentation. One advantage that we have, I did want to point out, we're one of 17 Department of Energy laboratories, and we all have our unique capabilities. So I'm just speaking on behalf of INL, but my fellow labs do a lot in this space with federal partners. And public and private sector. I think probably in terms of supporting, we're looking at doing things that the private sector and probably academia can't do. And we focus on those challenges and bring our immense of capabilities that we have to support that, in particular in operational technology.
Yeah, just to follow on that, and then we'll go over to Matt. But Ollie, just really quickly, can you talk a little bit about what INL brings in terms of what industry and academia perhaps can't do in this space, and maybe this overlaps with your role at the Resilience Optimization Center at INL as well?
Yeah. I also serve as the executive director of the INL Resilience Optimization Center. Essentially, what that means is, in my role, I work to bring the full capabilities of the laboratory. We have over 6,000 employees. We have 890 square miles with several ranges out in eastern Idaho and Idaho Falls area. So my role is to bring those capabilities. So we're not operating in a stovepipe fashion. When someone brings a challenge to us, we're able to bring the full capacity of the laboratory. I think what's unique about us is most private sector, and probably not really any private sector, has 890 square miles, multiple miles of electric grid, water test bed, wireless test bed, where we can actually full scale test things. So not only do the research and development up front, but also do modeling simulations with things like our controls laboratory, that is, by the way, sponsored by DHS CISA. And then we're able to bring that into small scale and large scale. So we can spend the time working on those challenges that are emerging or that are currently perplexing the nation when it comes to operational technology.
All right. Well, we'll get into some of that in a bit. And Matt, I wanted to turn to you though here and talk a little bit about how CISA obviously is the nation's risk advisor and critical infrastructure. These 16 critical infrastructure sectors all face a degree of cybersecurity risk, and that includes the operational technology that is so central to those sectors. How has CISA been approaching this OT security issue when it feels like IT security sucks all the air out of the room most of the time?
Yeah, sometimes, all of the IT security alerts can certainly take up a lot of air, but, we are the nation's security agency for defending U.S. critical infrastructure. And so we have the lead for both like national coordination efforts, but also for helping people from preparing them for an incident, making sure that they're secure now, be that via guidance we've released on foundational measures for doing an asset inventory for OT, be that free services we provide, like we provide external vulnerability scanning for free to critical infrastructure partners so they can, maybe they already have a service and this is just a third party way of seeing the quality of what they have. Maybe they have no security services seeing what they have exposed externally. We'll let them know if they have any known exploitive vulnerabilities out there exposed publicly to the internet. So we'll help them with preparation via assessments, via these free services. We'll also do incident response. If we have a major incident, we have incident responders who will show up on site, we'll record the TTPs, and we'll help somebody's right of boom be somebody else's left of boom, right? We'll communicate that information out across the U.S. critical infrastructure sectors, be it just that sector, be it through the ISACs, be it through our Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, to ensure that people are aware of any threats that are occurring. And then we, more long-term, more strategic, we also do a lot of work trying to push where operational technology is going to go so that in the sense of it being secure by design, how do we make sure that the problems we have today from all of this legacy infrastructure, all of our existing critical infrastructure deployments that have been around for decades, they weren't designed with security. It's kind of an ever-going mantra with OT that some of these things are just insecure by design. How can we make sure that the next generation of equipment is better so that as asset owners are buying new equipment today, 5 years from now, we don't show up 20 years later and say, hey, you bought this in 2026, it's legacy infrastructure and it's really insecure by design. How do we actually strategically move the field across vendors, across integrators, across asset owners?
And in terms of what we're seeing today, in terms of threats to operational technology specifically, I mean, as I mentioned, we have seen the alerts around Volt Typhoon, specifically maintaining persistent access on critical infrastructure networks. And I think there's been some reports that they are, at the very least, attempting to obtain data about OT operations on these networks. What concerns you the most about the threat landscape when it comes to OT security today?
I think there's two primary threat actors I'm concerned about, or at least categories of actor. One are these lower skill, lower sophisticated threat actors who are targeting internet exposed components. So they're finding an internet exposed OT device, they're just searching on a service like Shodan or something else. They're finding it and then they're logging in. Maybe it doesn't have a password, maybe it's using a default password, or increasingly it's just using a password that's pretty simple to crack. And then they're doing that, they're messing around with the interface. And right now, they haven't caused, substantial, really expensive impacts to those individual entities. But these people might get more skilled over time. And, this is a sort of threat actor where it's not like more sophisticated threat actors won't use the internet exposed assets. It's just a little noisy right now. The other side of this is Volt Typhoon, more of these PRC affiliated nation state, high skilled nation state threat actors who are coming in from the IT side, compromising edge devices, dumping credentials, and then trying to then pivot into the OT network, both from a prepositioning, creating a societal panic perspective, but also from the idea of can we exfiltrate information about the OT network so that we can do more harm and do more damage to it than just either making sure that we can execute a denial of service or making sure that we can do something much more scary and cause, real substantial harm. So, that's what I'm really concerned about. And that's why a lot of the CISA efforts are focused on, well, how do we uplift the resiliency of existing infrastructure such that even if there is a successful attack, the impact of it is lower. And, that's through efforts like INL's cyber-informed engineering work, which, they champion alongside the Department of Energy, but also through some of these secure by design efforts to say, well, how can we embed security in these components such that that we can reduce the likelihood of a successful attack?
It'll certainly keep you up at night, some of those threat scenarios. And I appreciate the kind of lead in there because Ollie, I wanted to turn to you next and just ask about some of that cyber secure informed engineering. When it comes to these OT networks, Matt laid it out really well there in terms of the vulnerabilities and the threats. What is INL doing as far as advancing these best practices through its research and its testing and its work with the community?
Yeah, I'm glad Matt mentioned secure by design. He mentioned cyber informed engineering because former CISA director Jen Easley, in fact, in some of her comments, she meant they're complementary. Where secure by design, you're getting it at the manufacturer stage, where cyber informed engineering is you're trying to engineer out the kill chain. And then really the doctrine behind that is that a determined, well-resourced, and patient adversary will eventually get into your system. And if you work from that mindset, then how do you engineer out? And engineering could be building resilience. Doesn't mean a new, the latest gadget that's out there. And it's really based around, the concept of starts with, why are we doing this? It's critical function assurance. So when you talk about critical infrastructure, we have to have services that we have to maintain in the core sectors, beginning with the lifeline sectors, energy, transportation, water, telecommunications, that everybody's dependent on. That's why we're trying to do it. What we're going to do, that's a strategy that Matt pointed out, cyber informed engineering, where you engineer it out, whether through, secure by design through the manufacturing process, or you have as-built infrastructure that's not going to be replaced anytime soon. It's very expensive to do that. And then the approach you go about doing that is, how you're going to do it is, consequence-driven cyber informed engineering, which is the actual four-phase approach that we've been taking out to industry. We've done it now in aviation, some core systems. We've done it in energy. So it's really not that INL does it for you. It's actually, changing the culture, even in things like engineering school, where you're teaching them that you need to be thinking about this early on as an engineer. And then things like through Accelerate Workshop, which is CCE based, and actually you're training the trainer. You're actually giving them the tool set to go out and run these within your own organization, and starting with the most critical cyber systems, and then working your way from a risk-based, prioritized approach.
Yeah, and I wanted to dig into something you said there. Some of these systems are not going to be replaced anytime soon, and of course, we want to secure them with or design them with security in mind right off the bat going forward. But in terms of the infrastructure that is there today, what are some of the things that you think folks should have in mind based on kind of your work with aviation, with energy, in terms of securing those systems, the challenges with securing some of these legacy systems that need 100% uptime. It can't go down for an update or a patch necessarily, and bringing in that resilience factor as well, because I think that's something that's not always brought into these conversations as far as cybersecurity.
Yeah, I will tell you that one thing that we found in the aviation effort and other efforts is that as a whole, and there are pockets of excellence, obviously, but as a whole, when you look at risk, consequence, vulnerabilities, and threats, organizations, entities are still chasing vulnerabilities and responding to threats, and they're not really starting with the main piece, which is consequence. Figuring out what's the most important things and starting with that. So you're not going to be able to change everything. So if we throw our hands up there, we're not going to be able to change all our infrastructure. We have these components all over the system. Well, what within those systems are the most ones that you would least like to lose? And you start there. There's a lot of tool sets out there. We have network, diagnostic tools like Malcolm that's available on GitHub. That's freely available. So I think it's the general answer, because it's hard to talk about a specific entity like aviation because everyone's like a fingerprint. They're all unique. But generally is starting with the consequence being forward approach, and then bring in the right tool sets and focus on those top systems first. That will cause you your worst day.
Makes a lot of sense. And Matt, from the cybersecurity perspective, I think there's a lot of playbooks out there for how organizations at this point can secure their enterprise IT. But what is the playbook for these OT systems, kind of building off what Ollie said around, managing that risk?
Yeah, we pushed out a lot of guidance in this area, from asset inventory, sort of the high level know what you have guidance, to how do you do vulnerability management for these OT systems with tools like SSVC. Sorry, it's CVSS backwards. And so I'm always double checking in my head that I have, in fact, said CVSS backwards, which allows you to do basically a mapping of, hey, given a vulnerability, how big of a deal is it for the corresponding system to go down? Do I need to prioritize this immediately? Do I need to prioritize this later? So we have sort of that higher level guidance. For the sector specific resilience, I really do think it comes down to the domain expertise and sort of the crown jewels of the day, because there are kind of a lot of different approaches to securing operational technology. I would say the vast majority that we see is sort of kind of a bubble method, which is this idea of we're going to focus a lot on segmentation and we're going to focus a lot on continuous monitoring around the edge of that perimeter of the bubble and maybe a little bit inside of the bubble. And we're basically hoping that a threat actor isn't able to compromise the actual OT network. Now, with threat actors like Bolt Typhoon, CISA is very concerned about that approach because we need more defense in depth. We need more ability to understand and prevent the impact if they actually got access to the OT network. And that's where a lot of these ideas like CIE come in. It's where we start asking more questions about where do we prioritize monitoring? What are the crown jewels of your systems? What do you care about? I mean, like we were talking about earlier, I mean, a specific example for avionics would be, there's protocols that are still in use today, like MIL standard 1553, like ARINC 429, where a lot of them have safety protocols that are built in, where you just send a single message and all of the computers turn off. Now, the reason why all of the computers turn off is because it's built for safety. If a computer is having a hardware failure and breaks down, obviously you want to be able to switch to whatever redundant avionics computer you have. And so it just makes sense. Like it's really well engineered, it's really well designed. It just isn't really well designed for cybersecurity threats around a malicious actor. And so if you're thinking about, hey, like, as an asset owner, what can I actually do to fix this legacy problem that I have? You have a couple of different options, right? You could say, well, I don't think somebody is reasonably going to get access to this network. So I'll harden the boundary points. I'll say, okay, to get access to my plane, well, it's an RF attack vector, a physical access point. Well, I've got physical security. I can harden these particular components. I think I'm good. That's one approach. You can add continuous monitoring onto the actual network itself and try to identify anomalies. Now, that might get really expensive. Or you can start doing things like ripping and replacing old components to try and actually do those upgrades. Now, that's really expensive. Most entities aren't going to get there. And more along to the sort of CIE, secure by design approach, what I really want to encourage is thinking about what are those critical components where, hey, this is your bad day if this gets attacked. So in a lot of these avionic systems, there's a key mission computer, a bus controller, and it tells everybody else what to do. And so if you are going to send any of these attacks by sending these erroneous safety messages, well, they usually originate from that singular bus controller, that singular crown jewel in your network. And so if you add a bunch of security to that singular component, well, that's a much more reasonable cost than adding, cryptographic key modules to all of your computers designed in the 1980s, right? That isn't going to go very well for most people. And so you can start thinking about where can I do these targeted small scale upgrades with, in the now, and start thinking about procurement and how do I buy myself or upgrade my existing systems in the future once I have a bit better capital expenditure window to actually do larger scale systemic upgrades.
That's a fantastic example. Appreciate that. And one thing I was wondering early on, you mentioned that CISA offers free services to critical infrastructure, vulnerability scanning, and other things to help them address some of these issues. What kind of uptake have you seen on those, and are you looking to make any improvements or additions going forward?
Well, we're always looking to improve our services, which maybe too easy of an answer, but we do have quite good uptake for those, particularly the ones that scale better, like external vulnerability scanning. I mean, we have over 10,000 critical infrastructure entities that have signed on to those services. We're always capped out on the assessments we do every year. We basically are at the limit for our current capacity for how many we can do. But as part of a lot of these assessment modernization efforts, as part of a lot of our incident response efforts, we're actively in the process of improving the services so that they can scale to more people. Might be a lower fidelity version than sending a bunch of OT experts to your door in person, but seeing where we can actually improve and scale those offerings to give everybody a little bit more of a bit of a security insight into their operational technology network. Now that might be through our regions, working with our cybersecurity advisors in the field. We encourage everybody to talk to their regional advisors. You go on CISA.gov/regions. It'll tell you who that is. You can get in touch there and get some more hands-on in-person help. But for the actual, deep technical in the weeds cybersecurity expertise, we're going to prioritize those to the systemically important entities. But we still have to help everybody else, right? Because it's regardless, if that critical infrastructure goes down, it's still a bad day for a lot of people. And so we're working to scale our services so that we can get broader uptake amongst those smaller groups like the munis, like the co-ops.
Does that come down to essentially funding and the amount of capacity that you have to be able to offer those services at this point?
Yes, I mean there's what 50,000 plus like water entities that have served less than 3,000 people. So realistically, we're not going to go through site by site and go to all of those entities. But in practice, right, like we do want to provide cybersecurity assistance, and those entities do matter, particularly to their local communities. And so we are trying to improve and offer more services that scale better to hit both those small and large audiences. And you also have to think, coming back to some of your workforce points, we also need the capacity to make sure that they can actually understand our recommendations, right? How do we tailor our guidance for different maturity levels? Because if the security person at that small water entity is also running their engineering, has a ton of other tasks they're doing in a day, well, maybe a 50-page how-to manual is not the best approach, but giving more targeted recommendations tailored to their maturity level is going to be a lot better. And so, we're actively doing work to make sure that our existing services are consumable, but always improving those to make sure that they can reach more people.
Fantastic. All right. And perfect timing. Ollie, I wanted to turn to you next to ask about some of the work INL has done on workforce. You've done some assessments, I think, of the aviation sector specifically and their skills and OT security. What has INL found there?
Yeah, from a workforce maturity model, I think in terms about operational technology, the workforce is really, I think it's probably we spend a lot of time on that from the things that we learn and the technology. How does this all apply to the workforce? And really, the workforce is the biggest gap. Well, what we found is that in the aviation, particularly airports, at least the ones that we've done, you have trends like we're still at that stage where we do our annual security awareness training, right? So when you look at maturity scale, 5 levels, we're still down at 1 and 2, generally across because people are busy, right? These are small groups that run the IT/OT systems at an aviation authority, for example. So it's important to focus on how do you bring up the skill set of those groups, and of course you have changeover that goes along with that. So we found that one, there's not a lot of role-based cybersecurity focus, which means that you could be an entity where, say, you're in a county aviation, and they're using county job descriptions for people they hire that's going to go to the airport division. And they're not going to be doing general IT things. They're going to be worried about baggage handling systems, passenger information systems, people movers. So it's going to be a different ball game. So right skilling that. One of the other things that we in a project we did with Florida over 3 years that we're still in, where we helped them. A good example of using a CISA tool, the cybersecurity evaluation tool that we've developed for DHS. It's been around 20 years. We built a customized assessment platform to meet a state mandate to do statewide cyber risk assessment using the NIST cybersecurity framework as the model and the ransomware readiness assessment model. Use those and then built a visualization tool that does cyber risk. And the biggest finding we found is not the tech side, it's managers don't understand cyber risk. So when you got people that are sitting in procurement, human resources, operations, if they're not understanding cyber risk, they're making decisions that impact cyber risk, whether it's from letting a contract or procurement. So it's not just getting the tech workforce. That's a continuing problem. We just don't have enough people like that, and they're not all role-based trained to the right competency levels. But it's also the management side that's surfacing as a big gap.
In terms of bridging that gap, are there any successful approaches to get folks to care about these issues and to have the toolkit to address them at some level?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the Cyber Florida example. So, okay, that's great. You did this assessment. You told me what my gaps are. I'm already a small resource constrained water utility in a county of 60,000 people. What am I going to do about it? There are a lot of resources out there. There's a tremendous amount of resources. Matt pointed out a lot of those, and through the citizen delivery model. I came from DHS, from the agency. I spent 13 years in the field, so I know what the demand signal is. So what Cyber Florida ended up doing is working with us. They built an AI-enabled resource mapping capability. That so you now when you take the assessment, it starts with entry assessment, a bigger mid-level assessment, then a full assessment. It gives you your gaps, but then it maps it to the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education and Workforce roles, skills, and tasks. So it tells you these are the roles, skills, and tasks most prevalent with your gaps. And then maps that to specific resources, because as Matt pointed, you can't give somebody a 50-page guide. You got to say, these are the 5 things you're going to do. And by the way, here's the template, here's the training source, here's the guidance on that to help you mitigate that vulnerability. So you got to almost build a digital consultant to help them manage it, because they don't have the time or resources. They have full-time, day jobs, sometimes night jobs in their world. And you got to help them, navigate their resources, that sea of resources.
Matt, what's your perspective on this issue of workforce and the skills gap in the space?
I mean, there are certainly a lot of problems with equipping people with the right skills to understand, but I think a lot of it comes down to, beyond just do we have enough people? A lot of it, in my experience, comes down to where does that border lie between whose responsibility is what? So unclear messaging, in the spirit of this panel being on sort of IT OT convergence, right? Like whose responsibility is what between the edge of the IT network to the DMZ to the networking devices in OT versus the actual engineering components. It varies significantly by organization. We just wrapped up some voice of customer research on secure communication. We're asking all of these people, hey, like, where does your kind of boundary lie? What are you responsible for? What are you not? It very dramatically, even between similarly sized organizations within the same sector. And so, making sure those responsibilities are clear is one area. The other half of this is, a colleague of mine gave a excellent talk called with a rather provocative name of, why cybersecurity awareness won't save us. And it's this idea of how can we get away from this idea that we need all of our operators to understand cybersecurity and instead move towards more of a human-centered design approach and say, well, what do they actually need to understand, and how can we drive the complexity out of the equation so that it is easier for them to do the right thing? Getting to some of these sort of secure by default ideas, right? If an operator is creating a shadow IT network or not changing default passwords or adding these remote access configurations, it's probably because it's the easiest thing for them to do in order to do their job. And so while it's nice to have additional cybersecurity expertise to tell them, well, no, this is wrong, this is right, you should do it this way, you should do it that way, what we're really pushing for from the CISA side is how do we put more responsibility on the manufacturers, on the integrators to deploy these things in such a way that, yes, it fits within the operator workflow. Yes, it meets all of these 24/7 operational demands, but it's also secure. And some of that just comes from how do we encourage people at the manufacturer level to include their cybersecurity teams with their actual product development teams. Because I assure you, all of these big engineering companies are doing product research on how people use their products. Of course they are. They want their product to be easy to use. But there's a difference between easy to use with the cybersecurity on and easy to use with the cybersecurity off, right? And so we need more of that sort of pairing of work to help drive that down. And that isn't just on the actual vendors, right? That becomes a feedback cycle of, well, why did the integrators turn these security features off? Well, their cost to deploy that infrastructure went from 2 weeks to 3 weeks of labor because it improved or increased the complexity of deploying an environment with security on. Trying to get those insights to help companies drive down the complexity of the environment, or saying, hey, the operator, it was deployed securely this way, and the operator turned it off because they couldn't get their systems to work or they couldn't provide their critical function. Like those sorts of insights and carrying that back to the actual manufacturers, back to the integrators, and then ultimately through to the operators is, I think, where CISA lands as a sweet spot for helping both improve our own services, but also to drive out some of these ambiguities of whose responsibility is what in this shared service, shared responsibility model we have between the vendors, between the manufacturers, between the integrators, and between the operators to make sure that Yeah, I mean, you can all point fingers at each other and say you're in charge of cybersecurity. The reality is everybody's in charge of cybersecurity. But where you have a role in it and where you can introduce all of the cybersecurity changes from design through to deployment through to operations. And so with CISA services, but also just with general awareness of this problem and providing more drivers to encourage security by design, we can help kind of shrink some of these misunderstandings and ideally have less of a workforce shortage because of it.
Understood. It's not just counting those numbers that folks put out as far as the hundreds of thousands of people we're short in the cybersecurity workforce. Um, One interesting thing that came out of the recent Burlington Cyber Summit that I took note of was, I think it was a water utility in the Northeast, mentioned that the cybersecurity business model is not always aligned with the needs of OT as well. Things like licenses and just how that works. I'm wondering for either of you whether that's something that's you've noticed as well, if there's any work to kind of take that on and or fill that gap. Any thoughts there?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is we mostly see this from a licensing and sort of operational expenditures perspective, where if you're operating one of these big critical infrastructure sites, a lot of your actual budget flexibility to, say, procure cybersecurity tools comes during your capital expenditures. And so once you enter into an operational environment, your ability to do what a lot of these security vendors do, which is charge more of these sort of recurring costs, is a little bit more difficult to justify from a budgetary perspective for many of these operators. Or the flip side of that is, or rather an extension of that, is also more on like the warranty policy front, where the way a lot of these safety cases work is that you're going to have something like a site acceptance test that says this is all deployed safely, this all works very well, the vendor has given it a check mark, and you cannot change it from here on out. Where security is meant to be a bit more agile. So we have this very structured safety process and a security process that wants to be much more agile and much more reactive. And you're trying to merge the two of them together. And I think a lot of that ends up coming down to communication and different governance models and how we can align these two things. So again, we're trying to tackle some of this with some of the secure by design questions, with making sure that some of the security features that don't need to be these recurring cost models can instead be factored into cost elsewhere, or for things like basic logging, just factored in, period, just for free in the product. But yeah, it's mostly just around the security cost and the agileness of security can conflict with some of the existing more rigid processes in OT.
Great response. I think at the end, I would add, to me, it kind of goes back to the management side. If you're talking about the business model and doesn't fit the business model, you're talking about the C-suite, you're talking about the senior leadership team that's generating that. And if they don't understand cyber risks, they're not accounting for OT. And one of the questions a lot of times we ask out when we're doing our work is, do you understand the degree of IT OT convergence in your operational environment? And that's going to be different, right? The water sector in the Northeast versus a small manufacturer that's providing, some critical components to the defense industrial base, but maybe not been to these mom and pop operations. They're going to be different. And you have to understand that to be able to roll that into your business model. And I would say it's a lot better than when I started 20 years ago at DHS, but there's a lot of work to do in that area.
In terms of what we've been talking about around secure by design, secure by demand, I'd love to get both of your perspectives and some of the work that is going into OT secure by design. Some of the perhaps differences with what's happening in the IT space and some of the overlaps, and where that is going in terms of the future of this infrastructure.
Yeah, for secure by design, the operational technology work at a high level principles level is the exact same. We're trying to drive out a lot of the costs and the up and up and up that is security costs across the industry by saying, hey, we keep seeing the same vulnerabilities over and over again. How can we shift the burden to the manufacturers to address some of this at scale rather than having increasing security costs for every critical infrastructure entity in the United States? Where the OT effort differs is kind of two different focuses. One is on capability. So rather than focusing more on risk reduction and, hey, where did this vulnerability come from? What is the root cause of this vulnerability via something like a CWE? We very much still care about those sorts of things. But given the legacy environments that exist for a lot of OT, be it completely insecure communication models, be it a lack of role-based access control, particularly in these older components, we wanted to make sure that Secure by Design is focused on moving people to a more defensible foundation so that I don't get a critical infrastructure owner 5 years from now saying, hey, the government told me there were all these threats. I bought a new product. You're telling me 10 years later I bought a legacy product again, right? How do we actually help people transition from their legacy architectures to something that is more secure by design, that is more defensible, that includes logging, ICAM, secure communication, as just sort of a things that are taken as a given in an enterprise environment. And the reason that's difficult is obviously both the legacy environment itself, but also all of the operational restrictions that come with running one of these critical infrastructure environments, which is why a lot of the focus is instead not on, hey, just have this capability, but also, is it usable? This gets back to some of the human-centered design elements we had before. How can we drive out the complexity? When I said we were talking, or we were doing this voice of customer research on secure communications with operators, the focus of that was, hey, we have these industrial protocols that we've been using in the field for literal decades, like Modbus, like DMP3. We know they're insecure. We know they have problems with them. Secure solutions exist. There's DMP3 SAV2, SAV5. There's an upcoming SAV6. There's Modbus over TLS. There's OPC-DA to OPC-UA. Right? There's all of these protocols that are open standards, have secure versions, but people don't use them that broadly. And so we wanted to understand why, because obviously the answer can't be, well, operators don't care about cybersecurity. They do. They care about authenticity. They care about the integrity of their systems. But the cost and the complexity and their concerns about impacting the availability of their infrastructure is what kept them from trying to use these new solutions. So we've got a paper coming out sometime in the next couple of months, detailing more on these insights. But this all just goes to say, for Secure by Design for the OT side is really focused on how can we actually drive complexity out of the system and help people bridge the gap between their legacy infrastructure and where we want them to be so that they're going to be in a much more defensible position in 5 years.
Great overview, Matt. And if I could just follow up really quick, I know CISA also put out a paper, Secure by Demand considerations for OT owners and operators back in January.
Yeah.
Any initial feedback, insights on that and the response to that?
Yeah, we've gotten quite a bit of good feedback on that. Worth noting, that was one of the first pieces of guidance that we put out from CISA that was co-sealed by the European Commission. And part of the reason that we did that is, operators are facing a larger international regulatory push, be it some upcoming regulation targeted towards OT from the UK, the Cyber Resiliency Act in the EU. And we want to make sure from the US perspective that operators are aware of these different cybersecurity requirements, but also, as a global security community, that we're all sort of in lockstep and saying, hey, these are good security fundamentals to have in your product. And so take advantage of them where you can and making sure that, if you're thinking of these global OT manufacturers that are selling in all of these countries, that we all sort of get very similar security benefits. In terms of feedback, the feedback has been quite good. It's resulted in a lot of interesting follow-on work, both from the secure communications perspective. We did that voice of customer research because we got follow-ups from industry saying, well, hey, we know there are all these solutions and we know they don't work, but like, why? Why not? And so we said, okay, well, let's do more research on this problem. Or from a secure by default perspective, this is a growing area of concern from or area of interest from an international perspective. So we got invited to groups like ISA IEC 62443, one of the main industrial standards for automation control systems, to help write some of that secure by default language based off the guidance we were putting out. So we've definitely gotten a lot of good uptake. And I would say that the main priority from our perspective in terms of follow-up is focusing more on these sort of sticky problems, the areas where, hey, if I bought a system today, it would be very expensive for me to add this in retrospect. So if I do get stuck in a legacy infrastructure environment, this is going to be something where I should prioritize, I should start thinking long-term about it in order to help get off. And that's things like secure communication, that's things like strong authentication, as well as ideas like secure controls, which are much more in the CIE sort of camp, of saying, hey, how can I reduce the impact by making sure that my systems are designed with the idea of a cybersecurity attack coming down the pipe. So we're trying to focus on that to help people transition off of those legacy environments.
Okay, Ollie, I know you have a perspective here as well, please.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. So I think Matt and CISA, as a nation's cyber defense agency, they're on the front lines today with state, local, tribal, territorial on this topic. As a national laboratory, one of our core focus areas is cyber physical systems. So we're also looking at, what's 5 years down the road, what's 10 years down the road when you look at it from a threat perspective, because if the threat or the threat vectors change, that's going to impact the vulnerability that can be exploited, which is going to cause those consequences that we talked about. So we spent a lot of time on, getting a demand signal from CISA and from other partners and other sectors, but then also looking at the R&D that's needed, 5 years leading up to 5 years down the road to tackle that next challenge. CIE is one thing that's out there. Now we're looking beyond CIE. If you can get that out there, great. But what do we need to complement the next risk environment that's going to emerge out there?
I assume, especially in your role in the energy department, there's some support for what the CISA organization is doing there in terms
Yes.
of future energy grids.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you just name the sector. The water sector, for example, is one that's actually implemented consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, especially for the smaller water municipalities. But obviously, as a DOE laboratory, the energy sector, we're doing a lot with CISA and the Grid Deployment Office and Office Energy, all those players.
Well, and then in terms of the future 5, 10 years down the road, when you talk from a general cyber perspective, obviously folks are discussing the implications around artificial intelligence, both from a defense perspective as well as from the threats that it brings to some of these systems. There's quantum computing, quantum threats. What are some of the future technology considerations that drive some of the conversations around cybersecurity in the OT space that you're focused on?
Yeah, I would say that the underlying core theme of all this is that as you're considering emerging technology, if you're talking about AI, you're talking about quantum computing, if you're talking about, we're working on 6G in our wireless test bed. So all these going to grow and emerge and evolve over time. The core piece is, are you building resilience into your approach, into your system? For us, it's from an R&D perspective. We're an applied lab, so we try to develop capabilities based on research and development and providing places like DOE, DHS, and DoD capabilities and subject matter expertise. But it's really about resilience. If you're not having a resilience mindset, security is not a strategy. Security is important, but security fails, as we see. Just watch the news every day. So it's about building that resilience mindset, and there are a lot of pieces to that. Again, I do want to emphasize that it has to be customized to the sector and subsector. I mean, there's over 54 subsectors across those 16 sectors, and they all have unique needs. So it's got to be something that's scalable, it's applicable as an overall approach. But I think to me always is, I rarely use the term cybersecurity anymore. I use cyber resilience because resilience, what if happens? What if you want to turn that to even if it happens, we're able to rebound and respond and continue those critical functions.
And Matt's sort of the same question for you, especially as you consider some of these secure by design and demand approaches going forward in terms of where emerging technologies are going.
Sure. So from an AI perspective, I mean, one of the main pieces from CISA is really focusing on how can operators embed any AI systems into their existing safety processes? So if you add a new system into your network, regardless of what it is, you're going to have a safety practice to make sure somebody's responsible for it, somebody's tracking how it works, and when to update it, when is it working fine, when is it not working fine, and making sure that you don't treat AI systems like some special new magic box, like AI is software, and making sure that you understand as an entity that no, this has to go into your existing safety processes, and you might add special considerations for the fact that it could need retraining, or there are circumstances where it might not work quite as predictably as some of the simpler statistical modeling approaches that you might have had before. To give a example that everybody has from their day to day, right? If I am, going to work, I plug some address in my GPS. I don't necessarily need to understand comprehensively how GPS works. I just need to understand when a GPS is going wrong so I don't drive off the side of the road, right? So I'm in a tunnel. I know GPS is probably off. I probably shouldn't trust it. Well, I've got alternative sensors. I've got my eyes. I've got my speedometer. And similarly for operators, they don't need to understand, the PhD in AI to understand how all this stuff works, but they do need to have that sixth sense to understand when is it explainable enough for me, and when does it get to a point where I need to stop, maybe go to a safety process, maybe revert to some manual system, maybe revert to the system I was using before. And that could be their own senses, be it what they hear, but it also just be standard processes for, hey, I have these alternative sensor inputs, and this tells me that I need to consider AI differently. Other emerging tech, I mean, the sort of stuff that excites me from a secure by design perspective is thinking through how do we have smarter components. So much more along the cyber-informed engineering piece, I've been trying to call this system-aware components. A good research example is, I come from a transportation hacking background, and so that's where all my examples are from. But one example is if you take an industrial vehicle built anytime in the 2000s, it uses this common standard called SAE J1939. Nothing wrong with the standard, but if you go and tell an engine while you're driving 60 miles an hour down the highway, if an attacker comes along and says, "I've plugged a new engine into your device, please turn off the existing engine," the engine that's already there will go, "Yeah, that makes sense. Sure thing, boss. Turn off the existing engine," and your car will stop very, very suddenly. The reason I bring that up is to say, from a common sense use case perspective, it doesn't really make sense. Like, in what world am I going down the highway and also installing a second engine? And so building that sort of complexity of thinking, almost like how we have for safety instrumented systems for targeted OT, right? Like taking that line of thought and applying it more broadly to how we do control in the OT environment, I think is a very interesting research angle that currently struggles to scale very well, but might be something to think about for emerging technology so that we can add resiliency into a lot of these systems and take a potential attack vector from this does something bad immediately to this raises an alarm and puts me in a degraded state, perhaps, but a safe state where I know exactly what's going to happen. Now, of course, there's complexities to that. Denial of service is always bad. Your degraded state in a car saying I, pull to the side of the road and stop works great in some settings, works really badly in like a natural disaster setting. And so, there's a lot of caveats and a lot of complexity to this. But I think that's an area of emerging tech that I think is really interesting to explore.
All right. Well, that's interesting, and common sense will still be important and be especially important in the age of AI and all these other things we're talking about. So
Mhm.
I think we could probably keep this conversation going for a while longer, but unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So again, I'd like to thank my guests. Ollie Gagnon is the Chief Homeland Security Advisor at Idaho National Laboratory, and Matt Rogers is the OT Cyber Lead at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Thank you to you both. Again, I'm Justin Doubleday. You're watching Federal News Network. Let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.